Well, hello and welcome to the Watering Hole. My name's Jonathan Thomas. If we haven't met before, I'm the pastor of a church in Abergavenny called Cornerstone. And once a month or so, we have these little sessions on YouTube where we look at the big questions in life. And this evening, we're looking at the whole issue of science, or faith and science, to be exact. And here's the question: faith and science, friend or foe? Well, I only just got a GCSE in science, so I'm not the man to answer this question. But I've got in a good friend, Professor Emil Macdonald from the School of Physics and Astronomy in Cardiff University. And we're going to have a discussion this evening about this whole issue of faith and science. But Emil, could you tell us a little bit more about your life and your current work?
Yeah, sure, John. I was brought up in Mid Wales in the Aberystwyth area. I'm a student at Cardiff in the late 70s, and then I was 3 years in Cardiff and 3 years in Oxford doing my PhD, and then I worked at the Universities of Bath, and then came back to Cardiff. I've been lecturing there since late 80s. So Elaine, I've got 2 daughters who've grown up, and I've been, as I say, lecturing since then, and also doing research relating to the use of large molecules for trying to develop technology like electronics. And so because life involves large molecules in the same way, it's been really interesting to see how we try and develop human technology with large molecules and how life does it, and being able to look at the parallels and also to see how life is so much more advanced really than any technology we can come up with in that kind of area. And I've been teaching the physics of life to 4th year class for a few years now.
Wonderful. Now, we've talked about science a few times in the past, and I once heard you say that theism makes more sense of science, which I thought was really interesting. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'll probably fill that out as we go along, but just a couple of pointers, really. First, in terms of the technology of the cell, what we've seen over the last 40 years or so has been a huge increase in the complexity of how cells work. It's been going on certainly since the 60s onwards. And you look at how the ideas of origin of life, how life started, come about, and it's hardly changed much in that time. So you just see this growing gap between what we understand of the complexity of a cell and ideas where the first cells came from. I think that's one pointer. Another is just in the area of what is science actually. Of course, I'm a physicist, and physics is just expressed through the language of maths. And you ask, well, what is maths? Well, I think most mathematicians would describe it in terms of, you know, a mathematical theorem is right. It's got a certain kind of simplicity and beauty that you recognize, and of course that it works when you're using it in some consistent way. And Paul Davies, who's an agnostic physicist, raised the question back in the 80s, how is it that a sense of beauty in the human mind actually explains how the universe works? What's the connection? Now, as a theist and as a Christian, there's no problem in terms of the connection between God giving us a mind that can understand the universe through a sense of beauty. It doesn't prove anything, you know, I'm just making pointers here. Secondly, if I can just quote even what Charles Darwin said, they had the horrid doubt that always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. So we're using our minds, and yet there's a question about the reliability, as John Lennox expressed it, in terms of if we knew that the computer, you know, the laptops we're both using at the moment were the result of mindless undirected processes, would we actually trust its output? And that underlies the whole question of how you do science, really. I'm not claiming that proves anything. I'm just saying they're pointers, and we can talk further about this idea of theism making more sense of science.
I love that illustration from John Lennox. I'd never thought about that. That's really helpful. I look forward to kind of unpacking that. But, I mean, what's your story when it comes to the relationship between faith and science? How have you come to your conclusions?
Well, I became a Christian around 15 when I was in school. And then, as I said, I was a student in the late 70s, and it was quite an antagonistic period to be a Christian and a scientist. Of course, Richard Dawkins was starting his writing and all that. And it just felt very few people could help you through the bog, really. And so, you know, my memory of is sort of when people ask questions, I would try and answer as best as I could. But I was never quite satisfied with that. And kind of late 20s and early 30s, I really felt, okay, I've really got to try and work out in a bit more detail what I think in this kind of area. And, you know, I always used to take a big gulp when someone asked me a question and try and explain. But I decided that because you see Christians writing different ways on topics like this, that I would actually read the atheist books, because I knew then that in no way would it be unfair to the atheist position, and trying to see where actually I disagreed with them and where the weaknesses were. And I learned a lot through that period. And then after, you know, some years, I started then initiating conversations around these areas with colleagues in the department and with scientists from different disciplines. And I found that they weren't nearly as thought through on these issues as I thought they might be, and found that actually the conversation was quite stimulating, and, you know, you didn't feel your back against the wall at all. You know, actually, it was opening issues that you know, led to deeper conversations sometimes. So that was kind of my experience. And then my research field started to move towards these large molecules and all that. And then you really start to see actually the science is pointing in a different direction from what the general population think it does. So that's been the kind of path I've been along, really.
So trying to kind of gauge where you are, Emil, on faith and religion and the Bible and creation. I mean, can you seriously say, as some Christians have, that the world was created in about 6,000 to 10,000 years, or 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, sorry?
Well, there are two positions that are very obvious amongst Christians, but actually there's a lot of people somewhere in between. There is this 7-day creation position that I understand where they're coming from on the Bible. But I feel that they are making more and claiming more from Genesis 1 than is actually clear. For instance, it seems to me the evidence points to a very old earth, and I don't think that Genesis 1 is pointing to an old earth. Necessarily, you know, I understand and happy to talk further. On the other hand, you've got theistic evolutionists who I feel have a tendency to just accept scientific theories and tend to play down what the Bible does say clearly. So I think one is claiming too much on the basis of the Bible and going against evidence, and the others might be just not taking the Bible seriously enough. So in terms of, we won't go into details as to why, but I take that the earth itself is very old, but that there was a literal first couple, you know, who rebelled against God as who'd given them everything. and that was comparatively recent. That would be my position on that. But I understand Christians take a range of positions, and we all have to be quite patient with one another. I think the main guiding principle I've always worked to is don't join one camp or other, just take one issue at a time and deal with that as carefully as you can.
I mean, there are such a wide variety of opinions on this, and it's encouraging to hear that you can take the Bible seriously and take the evidence seriously and work that through. And so, even whether you don't believe the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, or different things like that, you clearly do believe that God has created the world. So why do you believe that the world is created by God? What's the evidence for that?
Well, I think that just if I can say a little bit about my understanding of the Bible and what it's saying, that it's very clear, for instance, if you look, that God sends the lightning, he's in control of the rainfall, he sets the limits on the sea. Now, I could also explain each of those in terms of electrostatics, condensation, and the effect of gravity on a fixed volume of water. So we don't have to choose between explanations in that way. God works the majority of the time according to a pattern that he himself has set, and he can work outside that as well. So the fact that it says God does things by his word does not preclude mechanisms. So in terms of your question, I feel that scientific evidence points strongly to the fact that life couldn't have arisen just from chemistry on the early Earth. I'm not ruling out in terms of principle, because God could have done things entirely through natural processes. But I think the evidence doesn't point to that. But I'm not claiming that on the basis that the Bible rules it out. It's that the evidence points in that direction. And I'm open to people arguing differently on that. Now, in terms of why I've come to that conclusion about the origin of life, that it couldn't have come about by chemistry, I won't go into the detailed science, but again, some pointers. A crucial one for me is that, for instance, we've lived through a revolution in electronics where everything's gone from analog to digital. For instance, take televisions, whenever it was in the 90s or whenever. And it's based on starting with a code. You don't change an analog television to a digital just by taking out the odd resistor and capacitor. You've got to start again with a different code, but with a common code that is agreed. And then the readers and writers, etc., have to work to that code. It's a different design, even though the front screen looks exactly the same for both designs. Now, life works with DNA, which is a digital code to base 4 rather than base 2 as our electronics is. Well, if we postulate there was an earlier form of life that was much simpler, the equivalent of an analog life, so to speak, you've got exactly the same problem. How do you do the transition? You don't do it a step at a time. It's all code-based. And not only that, it gets more involved, because like with the television, the cameras, the editing software, the transmitting lists, the decoders and the televisions, all have to work to the same code. Oh, how do you now develop readers and writers that both work to the same code from simple chemistry on the early Earth? I mean, if you take even the old-fashioned Morse code, unless both the sender and the receiver both recognize the same agreed code, then all those dashes and dots mean absolutely nothing, just valueless. And I think that's a very deep point, at the origin of life. Just secondly, something that relates to my own field of research, that we've been looking at how you can use large molecules, in effect plastics, to make solar cell material for solar cells. And you can see how that's been developing, and it's quite a promising field. But of course, photosynthesis works with large molecules. And you look at how photosynthesis works, and you see many of the same principles involved. But you see it's far more advanced as well. And for instance, it converts carbon dioxide to oxygen, which is absolutely vital for life on Earth. You could get all the best, physicists, engineers, geneticists, biochemists together. We couldn't make anything like photosynthesis, and that works to the same extent. You can try and copy parts. But when you look at the whole energy system of life, it certainly is the case we wouldn't know where to start in terms of trying to make anything like it. Now that's, again, I feel a strong pointer. There are some trends that you don't mind me just mentioning as well, that I've noticed over the last 20, 30 years of scientists saying, we need to come up with some kind of new physics to explain the origin of life. Christian de Duve, the Nobel Prize winner, started saying things like this in the 90s, and Stuart Kaufman's recently written a book on it, claiming that you need a new physics. Now, what I find fascinating is when we look at how the cell works, you can explain it perfectly well. It's tough and complex, but you don't need any new physics. If you dive into the details of how things work, you can understand it in principle in terms of current physics. Yet where life comes from, they're claiming that you need a new physics. And it makes you wonder, well, actually, what is needed? Is it that we should be looking seriously to ask whether we should revise our understanding of science, or the hidden assumption of naturalism and atheism that there can't be anyone behind it? It's an open question, I'm not saying it's settled one way or the other, but I just find that trend fascinating, as I do in terms of the arguments for a multiverse, because this universe is so finely tuned to make stars and galaxies possible, as well as life. And so in both areas, the origin of life and the origin of the universe, you see this shift happening where people are saying we need some kind of new science or a multiverse with billions and billions of universes, and this is the one that just happened to work. And it just seems to me much simpler to say, well, actually, there was someone behind it.
And someone might be watching now and they're thinking, no, this is just God of the gaps. There are things you don't understand, so you're just putting God in there. And as we get this new physics, or we discover these multiverses, we will see it explained. I mean, sure. What do you make about that expression, God of the gaps?
Well, it kind of is something that people say that we can't explain the origin of life, say, scientifically, and so God must have done it. Now, I'd say it's emphatically not the case. 2 points. Firstly, the arguments are made in terms of, like digital code or whatever. It's all arisen from an advance in understanding of the science. The God of the gaps is based on an appeal to ignorance. This is appealing to advances in scientific understanding. It's an argument that couldn't be made in the mid-20th century. It's actually the advances since then that I believe are shifting the actual, where the evidence points, in fact. Secondly, I think that the God of the gaps description presents science and God as two opposing explanations. Whereas, in fact, science can be done equally well as a theist or from an atheistic framework. Really, what is in opposition isn't science and theism, it's atheism and theism as worldviews. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the number of Nobel Prize winners who have been atheists, there are very few, really. There's certainly a lot more theistic ones, and there's been published studies of that kind of thing. And in terms of the God that they're attacking, as John Lennox has helpfully pointed out, this whole area, really, that God is the God of the whole universe, not just the bits that we don't understand and we have to plug him in. In this context, I just asked the question of actually whether naturalism of the gaps is more common, more widespread. I've chatted a lot with scientists of different backgrounds about the origin of life questions. And they might be a little bit dismissive initially, but very quickly you come to an agreed position that actually it's very difficult to see how life could have arisen on the early Earth just through chemistry. And they'll agree on that quite quickly once you start discussing the science. But then you get a comment like, but of course one day we'll understand. Now, I think what they're doing is they're assuming atheism. There's a gap in a very big gap in the scientific explanation, but they're plugging naturalism, atheism into there. Naturalism is just the assumption that there's nothing apart from natural processes into a gap. And far more common and far more widespread, really.
That's a very interesting phrase, naturalism of the gaps. I think lots of people will be thinking about that. Emil, we've thought about science and how theism actually can help us make sense of science. And, it's been great to hear the different things there.
Yeah.
But also, again, in a conversation we had before, you said something else, which was this: theism makes more sense of life.
Yeah.
What do you mean by
that? The question as to whether theism makes more sense of science is open to debate. I'm very happy to debate it with people. I think that the question of whether atheism or theism makes more sense of life, I think is a far more clear-cut argument. Atheism struggles with dealing with human value in terms of the basis for human value, a basis for morality, and a basis for meaning in life. Now, atheists have morality, but my question is, do they have a basis for that morality that really holds together? And take, value of life. Each of our lives, is it really just a candle lit in the dark at death and blown out again at death? A few years ago, I had a tutee of mine come and knock on the door. I'd been tutoring his first 2 years, and he was in his third year, and asked, could you chat? So he came in and he said, I don't see any purpose in living. And I asked him, what's brought you to that conclusion? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, well, I used to be just molecules, and one day I'll be just molecules again, and maybe I'm just molecules now. And I thought that is quite an expression of the consequences of atheism. I pointed him to the different sources of help in the student union, etc. But I felt he wanted to chat and reason through these things, and we had a very productive conversation. But I said to him, what you've just verbalized is a natural consequence of everything that people claim is based on science. And, and we know it's a very real problem. Mental health is a huge problem with students and young people generally at the moment. If I can give one more example, that of the basis of morality. Take the example of a male lion joining a pride, killing off young cubs. You can see videos on YouTube if you fancy watching them. And it looks quite callous and heartless. Now, is that right? Or is it wrong? Or is it just life to be a lion? Clearly the answer is it's not right or wrong, it's just life to be a lion. Now, a couple have a young kid and they grow apart and the father leaves. And then there's a new partner on the scene and the child is, 2-3 years old. Up, awake a lot at night. The new partner gets impatient and, things just get about to worse. We hear of these things on the news all the time. In certain cases, the father ends up killing the child. Is that right? Or is it wrong? Or is it just life to be a human? Now, if we say we are just another animal, what is the basis for saying anything other? Well, it's just life to be a human. A very uncomfortable view of life. And then you just ask questions like, why do we put people in prison if they're just responding to biochemical urges? Or are they breaking some kind of objective morality? They're not straightforward questions, and I don't want to treat them simplistically. But handling those kind of questions from a purely atheist point of view consistently really leads to a very hard and difficult to live view of life. And I just wonder how much that kind of influence is actually affecting our society today in people's outlooks, So I do feel that theism makes more sense of life quite strongly than atheism.
I'm assuming that theism that makes more sense of life is one that you find through the Bible.
Absolutely.
So, as a scientist and a Christian, can you really believe the Bible, or do you need to switch off the scientific part of your mind in reading?
Oh, I just go back to a comment there. I mean, I've often, when you get nasty things happening on the news, some kind of cruelty, just ask over coffee or something. I wonder how people can do that. Surprising the silence that you get. You get the odd person who will start discussing. But from the Bible's point of view, the fact that man rejected God and went his own way makes perfect sense. But in terms of the intellectual side, the Bible, if you're a scientist, you're inquisitive in terms of evidence on whatever area, and obviously, the Bible is very important for me. I just give a couple of examples, if I may. One is we can read on the internet and wherever plenty of arguments for the resurrection of Jesus historically. One of the most fascinating things for me is the mention of rumors that followed the resurrection. For instance, in Matthew 28, it says that the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, spread a rumor that the disciples had come at night and stolen the body. And Matthew just says, and this rumor is circulating to this day. Well, rumors arise because there's a problem, there's an issue. A second example of a rumor is that at the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus is talking with Peter and John at the Sea of Galilee after his resurrection. And Jesus indicates to Peter he's actually going to have quite a tough death, a painful death. And Peter says to Jesus, well, what about him? Pointing to John. And Jesus says, well, if I want him to be around until I come back, what is that to you? And then John writes in his gospel, the rumor started that I would be around when Jesus came back, but that's not what Jesus said. Now, why on earth would someone write something like that if that conversation between Peter and John and Jesus after the resurrection had never happened? And, historians talk about incidental detail as being what really corroborates historicity. And, just the fact that those rumors were around is a very strong suggestive point in terms of my view. Another one where, intellectually I find it fascinating is, the Old Testament writers, they were of the view that they were a special nation that God had chosen, which is correct. And yet you find, writers like Isaiah and King David and the Psalms talk about the nations coming to God. And you think, from their viewpoint, that is crazy. That you and I are now talking in Wales, believing the same God. From their whole national viewpoint, that is a crazy situation. And yet, God's promise to Abraham made 4,000 years ago that he'd have a descendant through whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And in a sense, the whole Bible is an outworking of that single promise. And why it's so important that everyone does hear about Jesus and his death and resurrection as the hope for us all. So yeah, I certainly don't feel I need to leave my brain at the door when I start reading the Bible. It's a book that just makes sense of life, and more than that, it guides me in terms of my relationship with God on a day-by-day basis.
Emil, what I've really enjoyed in our conversation this evening is how you don't switch off your brain when it comes to the Bible or to God. And in fact, you don't even switch off your brain when it comes to science in the sense of naturalism or the gaps, but you're looking at the evidence, you're investigating. So one final question. Do you find it hard to be a Christian and a scientist?
Well, as I indicated earlier, when I was a student, I did. It was fine, but there were times at which I found it hard. But the developments I've been seeing in science over the years has made it much easier and actually fascinating. And also there's been a lot more resources developed. Mentioned John Lennox earlier, looking at his website gives you plenty of resources, and there are many others. So nowadays, when I'm asked, same question, isn't it hard to be a scientist and a Christian? I usually say something like, well, actually, it's not nearly as hard as I believe it will be to be an atheist and a scientist in about 30, 40 years' time. In that, if you look at the scientific journals, if you look at the media, they're strongly committed to naturalism and atheism, and trying to get arguments into, say, scientific literature is incredibly challenging. They reject any idea of a divine creator behind the universe, and that's been the case throughout my life. But I feel that over my lifetime, the underlying landscape of the scientific evidence has been shifting, as I've indicated. And I think it's often overlooked by media, and in a sense, it's all very strongly suggestive it's difficult to say, look, this proves beyond a shadow of doubt that, for instance, life could not have started from chemistry on the early Earth. But that, I'm very aware of that underlying shift. And sometimes talking with scientists, you feel like they're studying like a stained glass window that is very beautiful. And they're each looking at one little piece of the glass in tremendous detail. But they're trying to avoid the kind of shadow of an artist who's somewhere behind it. You know, the many who are simply atheists and they just get on with it. But I feel there's sometimes that unease when they just come face to face with the universe and with life in the way it works.
Emil, that's an amazing picture to end on, that idea of the stained glass window and kind of seeing the bigger picture and the artist behind it. And thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been fascinating. To everybody watching, if you'd like to learn more and think about this more, then you can go to our church website, abercec.org.uk. Also, we've got a back catalogue now of a year of these, and about 9 months ago, we did do an interview with John Lennox, who has been mentioned a few times, and he gives a talk and answers questions on death and the Christian faith and science. So there's a link to that below in the description. But Emil, once again, thank you so much for spending time talking to us, and hopefully we'll get you on very soon in the future. Take care.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to talk to you, John, as ever. All the best.